But firstly, I'd like to start with a general question around culture. So I'll let any of you, the panelists, pop in to say that. Culture has been noticed as a cross-cutting theme. How do we overcome this or create bridges in culture in order to do the work that we have to do? Would anyone like to address that question on culture? Lisa?
I'd just say, I mean, from when I was working in the field, it was
Is your mic on?
Oh, sorry. When I was working in the field, we had this interesting discussion being driven from some of the INGOs around, we were given parameters that we had to achieve in terms of women's involvement. And there was a lot of talk about women's empowerment. But the problem was it was seen as a women's issue, and if you empower women, there's a chance you disempower men. So that there was anti sort of feeling to supporting the programs from the men. And I think a lot of it, and it was certainly an eye-opener for me, was that it's accepting small steps, and that the huge change from the community. I visited in Pakistan, where the men's committee had this huge, lovely room and all the rest of it, and the women's committee had a purpose-built hut, which was about the size of this table. And I said, are you not offended by that? And they went, you've got to be joking, this is great, we have got a space of our own. And it was accepting that those little steps help to make a cultural change. And if we try and go far in two big steps, we won't make that change.
Yeah. Thank you. Making some compromises as we go. Sarah, did you want to touch on the culture?
I think in terms of sort of issues around culture and water and sanitation and gender and violence and etc., I think dialogue is it's really basic, but I mean dialogue and really listening to people and finding out what are the issues, what is the beliefs, and then where there are difficult ones, finding out ways to ask questions to get people to to question or to debate amongst themselves. I mean, I've been doing quite a lot of work on equality and non-discrimination in a development program actually recently in 13 different countries, and it's quite interesting. I went to 4 different countries and promoted debate amongst different people of different backgrounds using sort of similar questions. But sometimes you start out with sort of resistance, but once you ask the right question and the debate starts going, sometimes you find also that somebody will stand up and say, actually, I don't think this is right, or this is really important to our culture, and this is, and so I think really the dialogue and getting people thinking and talking and, and expecting, not always accepting that your culture is right. We have a lot of issues, being really sort of respectful, but also acknowledging where there are problems and where things are not acceptable as well.
Yes, thank you. As we aim to build back better, maybe there is an opportunity to create less inequality, but there are also those challenges. Did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, just a couple of small points. I mean, I guess in any context when you're intervening in a humanitarian context, you'd hope that you would be doing so with a better understanding of the cultural dynamics of the country overall. And I think that there is a bit more of a realization of that in humanitarian. And I think that, for example, the Ebola response, which highlighted starkly the need for anthropologists to understand. I mean, this is not a women-specific issue, but in terms of burial practices and so on, or body disposal practices, how impactful that had been on the spread of the disease. And that's not a typical mindset of humanitarians, is to think, bring in the anthropologist yet. Maybe it'll change. And then, but that sounds like a sort of longer term, wow, can we afford to do that? Is that practical, etc.? I think on a more immediate basis, building on what Sarah said, there's so much that you can do just to understand, like preferences and priorities that sounds obvious, but it's just not always part of needs assessments, and it should be.
Thank you. So I'm going to go on to another question for you, Elizabeth, on cash, but I may need some clarity from the audience. So giving out cash is hugely empowering to the recipient, as you sort of talked about. But in countries where women are inferior to men, how do you prevent the the cash from being a flashpoint? Did anyone want to give any more clarity on that question? If you'd like to.
Yeah, I asked that question. If you hand out literally cash and forget about the banking problems. If you literally give an envelope of cash to a woman who is inferior in the family in a normal cultural context, I could see that being a real problem for the dominant man in the family and creating maybe more problems than you're solving by trying to empower the woman.
Certainly, and I think both, in fact, two elements that you discussed there are quite risky, and I sort of was alluding to them earlier on. One is actually providing cash in an envelope. It's one that's quite visible, and to be honest, it's not really being used that much, at least at significant scale anymore, I'd say. And then in terms of, you're absolutely right. I mean, if the dynamics are already that it's the male in the household who is in control of the financial resources, then particularly in a humanitarian crisis when there's already a lot of instability within the household, you can't start to affect those dynamics, and it can be a flashpoint, as you say. So then the question has to be, okay, well, if the male is being targeted, how can we ensure that women and children's needs are being met? And I think that's where the evidence is actually quite strong, that if the value is calculated appropriately and the targeting is done well, plus is supported by sensitization linked to whatever the objectives of the program are, that the outcomes are predominantly positive, and then including on household dynamics.
Thank you, Isabel. Moving back to the wash area, we're going to look at, there are two questions here, and one is around the disposal of items such as tampons and pads, etc., and what can we do to reduce the waste, so thinking more about the environment as well coming into that. And the other is, how do we think we can encourage greater diversity in the people working in that sector for WASH? So if you could try and address two questions, that would be great.
Okay, so yes, disposal of items is still a really big challenge. And both, I did flash them very quickly, but not very quick, you didn't see them. But there's quite big different issues in relation to disposal. So this is one that you would throw away, use it once and throw it away. This is one that you reuse. So the issue with this one you need the disposal, somewhere to put it discreetly and to get rid of it, and then obviously it needs to get from that point to an end disposal point. This one you need to be able to soak it, then wash it, then dry it, which is a major challenge, because hanging that up in front of your brother or your father is a major issue in relation to the taboos and the shame associated with menstruation. And then obviously a lot of women and girls still use cloth rather than actually using a particular pad. So the disposal, even having any form of disposal mechanism, is still a major challenge in humanitarian contexts. Even in a camp context where there's managed water and sanitation facilities, a bathing facility or a toilet facility, often there is not a disposal mechanism. So if there are pits, people may tend to put them into the pit or even just leave it lying around. You know, one of the challenges with disposing of something like this is you don't want a guy to see it, but also you don't want another woman to see it either. It's taboo with everybody. So, you know, if you're in a unit and the bin is several, 100 meters away, getting it from there to there is also a challenge. So it is something that the sector is still really struggling with, and also because you need to maintain that system. So if you have a disposal system where you have a bin in a unit like we have here in the UK, for example, in a toilet unit, someone's got to come and empty that and then take it and dispose of it and burn it or bury it or whatever the mechanism is. There is, a move to, suggestion is that the reusable are perhaps more sustainable in the sense that you don't throw away so much waste. You don't have to have this disposal mechanism that then needs to be sustainable. But it does cause these challenges that then what does the woman and girl do in a cold climate when you need to dry this? And so that's another challenge. How can you encourage greater diversity? I think there has been an increase in diversity in the sector over the past 20 odd years that I've been working in the sector. There are even more women engineers that you see popping up every now and again, and there are a few in this room who I've worked with. So Sarah, who I have worked with in Pakistan. So I think there is an increase in terms of gender diversity, but still there's a big bias towards males, and particularly in these sort of gender, where there are really big gender power differences. I think another form of diversity that's really positive is that when I started out 20 odd years ago, and I'm sure you'd agree, there was a lot more European northern faces involved in making decisions, and now it's predominantly people from the country that's being affected, with a few other people, supporting from outside, and that's a really big positive in terms of increasing diversity. But there is still a long way to go, and I think there's also quite a long way to go in terms of commitment from agencies and people working in my field, in the WASH field, particularly in those really difficult circumstances where gender relations are difficult. And as I say, I think for me, they're even more important to find out ways to be able to reach people because of the limited ability and voice that people have. Sorry, that was a long answer.
This is a question for all of you, in fact. What one thing would you prioritise to support women in post-disaster? Which is quite a broad question. I don't know if anyone would like to sort of provide any more detail of that, or if you'd just like to have a stab at the whole question. Any more detail from somebody? No? Okay.
I think
Sarah?
not my field, but livelihoods. I think having ability to earn an income so that you're not under power of your, I mean, obviously it depends on the family dynamics and what you want to do, but I think having that income so that you're not fully dependent on a man or on other people is a really a big one for the long term. Yeah, my feeling. I don't know if you have.
Thank you.
I suppose Sarah said probably what I would be expected to say from the livelihoods background, and obviously cash is part of that investment into livelihoods. But actually I was going to say, it's more generic perhaps, but participation. I mean, making sure, if we look across everything that the three of us have been talking about, I feel like that's probably the uniting theme, which is that if they're involved in decision making over the nature of assistance and how that's going to be provided and how securely and so on, I think that guarantees more positive outcomes overall.
Thank you.
And I think that was what sort of I was going to say as well, so thank you. I think it's more around the involvement in the decision making, so the importance of having a diversity in the staff, that in that initial emergency response, which enables us to get a diversity of involvement of the beneficiaries.
Okay, thank you. I have a question as well that I'm going to ask, and if there are any others that have come in over the past 10 minutes, then feel free to bring them up. But in the meantime, so at the World Humanitarian Summit last year, there was a session which was highlighting the amount of abuse which is happening within the humanitarian sector by humanitarian aid workers, and the impunity that has potentially existed at times. And I'd just like to ask Lisa how that is, if that's improving, how that's improvement.
No, I think is my immediate answer. There's a growing awareness amongst humanitarian actors, and I think it's there was a recent case against NRC that were sued by Steve Dennis and were found to be grossly negligent. So there is a growing discussion around the importance of looking after our staff from an internal perspective. The debate about how do we hold people accountable for the growing number of attacks on aid workers is one that I think is in its infancy. And it was interesting at the World Humanitarian Summit, there was a lot of discussion and governments were saying, yes, we must protect health workers and health facilities because they're specifically identified in IHL. But there is no similar identification for the more general aid workers, and very few, and why the reasons are that NGOs are not standing up and saying, why are these things allowed to happen? Why are we not trying to seek justice? And there's many reasons that we can go into that. But another thing, there's an amazing lady called Megan Norbert who set up an NGO called Report the Abuse, who's willing to stand up and say, I was raped, this happened to me. And she's really pushing the boundaries along with a few other people about bringing the fact that sexual assault and sexual violence happens so much in the aid sector. And it's often not reported for all sorts of reasons internally. When it is reported, it often doesn't, it's reported through a separate line. So it doesn't appear in the incident reports, so it doesn't appear in the statistics, so nobody does anything about it because it's not happening, because it's not being reported. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and I think she deserves a lot of credit for standing up and pushing that. And it's also helping to raise awareness that a lot of the sexual assault, and it's not just it's the harassment as well as the worst case of rape. It's like here, it's not stranger rape, it's amongst colleagues, it's amongst people that you're drinking with, friends that you're meeting. So there's a lot that still needs to be done around that.
Thank you. And just to comment on the question you raised around the security being separate trainings, we had recently a security training in the Middle East in Jordan, and it was really well received as a women-only security training. So it kind of raised questions for RedR as to how do we address this? Is this something we need to do more often? And where are the benefits? Yeah.
I think I'm not a security specialist, obviously, but you know, I was quite struck when we did the violence work, talking to women in different cultures, women and men, about this issue. Some really surprising sort of challenges that women in certain contexts face that I wouldn't have even imagined. You know, like in an example from Afghanistan, where a female staff member, you know, cannot even be praised for a piece of work by her boss, because then it goes around rumours about sort of the sexual misconduct of that staff member because she was actually praised for doing a good job. The level of, you know, the types of problems that people face can be really different in different contexts. And again, the dialogue and, you know, just so critical to really understand those, you know, really severe, which has a really severe impact potentially on that particular person.
Thank you. Because going back to the participation in the decision making, in the discussions, to involve people from the beginning. And we're going to have a final question for
Can I just make one comment? Because I would like to contradict Sarah. Okay. You are a security specialist. Anybody who works in the humanitarian field is a security specialist.
Okay, thank you. Yes, correct. Sorry. I forgot my security training.
So this is regarding the incontinence issues which you were speaking about earlier, Sarah, and what are we doing to alleviate some of those challenges which you had highlighted?
Okay, so incontinence is one of my big passions right now. I'm actually someone who's been incontinent since I was a child. I have stress incontinence, and I had an operation a few years ago, although to be honest, I just sort of got on with it. But when I started hearing from people in the, you know, in reality in really difficult situations, and thinking about the reality of how they manage with soaking, you know, having to deal with soaking underwear and clothes and all the other things. So we're trying, I mean, I've been trying for a number of years to get this on the agenda for our sector, and we are getting a little bit of progress. And we actually went to New York for a meeting on a MHM toolkit, menstrual hygiene management toolkit. And while we were there, somebody else raised about incontinence, and we were like, me and one other woman were like, yay, someone else is taking it seriously. And we've now got a small group of people who are trying to get this on the agenda. And by discussing, we found a few examples of where people are doing something. So we had examples of, in fact, the lead organisation, I'd say, is Norwegian Church Aid, who have been trying to not just give out sanitary pads, but also to target older people if they need also sanitary materials. They're using sanitary materials, you know, as a sort of an interim, I mean, as one solution for incontinence. Handicap International have been doing some work with people with disabilities, particularly we had some examples in the Syria response in terms of giving out reusable underwear, it's a man's version, there's also a women's version, and some people have been giving out sort of reusable, I mean disposable pads, but again, I think it's the same issue as disposable menstrual pads. You know, whether you give them a packet, that's not much use because it doesn't last very long. So there are a few examples. I know in also in some Syria response, I think in Jordan, they've got some new things called like hygiene like little shops, that's not the term they used, where you can go and actually go and get with coupons some hygiene products, and they've actually, IRC, International Rescue Committee, have started including adult diaper, effectively, pads. So there's a little bit of movement, there's a bit more interest happening, and we're trying to get it on the agenda. So any of you who work in the humanitarian sector and can, and can start to push this one forward, because I think it's a really hidden issue, and it really needs a lot more attention than it's getting right now. But I think there's a little bit of a movement with more people talking about it, and we did get it into Sphere last time. Now it's about to be updated again, but I mean it was in passing, and not as serious as it really needs to be.
Okay, well, that leaves me to thank the panelists. I think you've offered fascinating insights into the challenges and the gaps in the sector, drawing from your experiences and what you've witnessed. So, just to highlight some of the issues that have been raised, which I think are quite pertinent, are the strengthening of dialogue, the challenges that are involved, but then how we combat that through participation. The kind of process of doing more good rather than just do no harm, can we do more good? How we incorporate the private sector and use the use of Visa and MasterCard, and this sort of growing change that I think that as humanitarians sometimes it's quite a challenge to actually take on sort of new ways of doing things where we're stuck in the different sectors that we've been working in for the past sort of 10, 20 years. And I think we've seen that quite a bit in the refugee crisis across Europe, where we've seen a lot of young volunteers take on new initiatives. And thinking about how we can learn from those and using that to empower women or alleviate some of the suffering that's going on. So as we move away and maybe some of that power is shifting back to the national staff, to those affected by the crisis, it's a great moment to sort of reflect on where we can go. Yes, there are challenges, but there's also great initiatives being set up and driven by women. So thank you very much for all your contributions, and thank you for the audience for all the questions that you contributed. Thank you.